you to everybody who decided to come spend an evening inside on this absolutely gorgeous fall night. I know before I came onto campus, I was spending every last minute in that beautiful sunlight. So I really appreciate your presence here. I'm Kristen Dumais. I teach in the history department, and I'm thrilled to be able to share this film for our daughters with the Calvin audience. And so I want to give a shout out to our many sponsors you can see up here, to Call, who kind of got this ball rolling. Actually, a number of different groups on campus within a week had approached me, and I said, you guys just talk to each other. And this is the result of that collaboration, and Safe Haven Ministries as well. And you'll be hearing more about them and their work in this community this evening also. So we are excited to have you here. And while people trickle in, as you can see, we have cookies and bars provided by Call. So we'll have time to chat afterwards and to connect. And we'll have time for a Q&A after the film. And we'll have a panel up here to discuss the film. The film is heavy. It's difficult, and particularly if this is a journey that you yourself have walked. And I'm guessing if you've come here tonight, you have a little bit of a sense of what we will be viewing and what we'll be talking about. But it is heavy. I thought I would start with a bit of a background on how this film came to be. And I have to say that it was certainly never on my bucket list to make a movie at all. And the issue of sexual abuse was actually not an issue that I set out to research particularly. And so this film was actually inspired by the last chapter in my book, Jesus and John Wayne. And that is not a book that was meant to focus on abuse. And that book, interesting origin story there, the origins of that book go back to the early 2000s. And it was actually to Calvin's students who prompted that. So I was a new professor here. It was back in around 2004, 2005, so very new, my first year. And I was teaching a course in U.S. history. And I gave a lecture on Teddy Roosevelt. And I'm a historian of gender and religion, and so I thought, Teddy Roosevelt, great example to show my U.S. history students how ideas of masculinity have changed over time. And Teddy Roosevelt is this famous example of a kind of new construction of masculinity in the early 20th century, a more rough and tumble masculinity. But masculinity isn't just linked to religious faith, where in many Christian communities we tend to think of it as such. So we talk about biblical manhood or biblical womanhood and so on. As a historian of gender, I know that ideas of masculinity and femininity are connected to all sorts of things, to economic structures, to race, to foreign policy, in the case of Teddy Roosevelt, to ideas of empire. And so I just put together this little lecture to teach them about masculinity and Teddy Roosevelt. Class, a couple of students, a couple of guys in the class, there's a book that you have got to read. And that book was John Eldredge's Wild at Heart. Oh, I always know, I get to know my audience with that comment, because if I'm speaking to secular audiences, like, never heard of it. Christian audience, if you are a Christian of a certain age, you have heard of that book. You probably have an old copy of it somewhere. Everybody was reading that book in the early 2000s. There were study groups at the dorms here at Calvin. My church, Roosevelt Park at the time, was hosting book studies on it for the guys, and then the women had theirs. It wasn't Wild at Heart. Theirs was Captivated, if you remember. And I had wanted to stay away from it. Not my thing. But I listened to my students, and I drove down to Family Christian Bookstore, bought a copy for $19.95, and opened it up and saw right there at the front was a quote from Teddy Roosevelt. And I started paging through, and I saw that this vision of quote-unquote Christian manhood was a very militant one, as was Roosevelt's conception of masculinity. God is a warrior God, and men are made in his image. Every man has a battle to fight and a beauty to rescue. And I thought, wow, this doesn't seem super biblical, but and what I came to see is that there were actually relatively few Bible verses in the book. Surprising for a book on Christian manhood. Instead, the model for this Christian manhood were Hollywood heroes. Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart, favorite. Soldiers, warriors, mythical and real, General Patton, right? These are your models of Christian masculinity. And I thought, again, this is kind of weird. Now, as a historian of gender, I was also curious, where is this coming from? And what is this doing? What is this doing for the men who are reading it in their churches, in their families, but also more broadly? And this was the early 2000s, and I started to see early on connections between this militant, aggressive vision of Christian manhood and evangelical views of foreign policy. I started to see, again, early 2000s, early years of the Iraq War. We had all this survey data coming out showing how white evangelicals were far more likely than any other demographic to support the Iraq War, to support preemptive war in general, to embrace aggressive foreign policy, to condone the use of torture, right? And this despite the fact that there are a lot of Bible verses that might not, in fact, support those things. Prince of Peace, love your neighbor, love your enemies, and all that, right? So I was curious, and I started digging in more. And then I saw it wasn't just foreign policy, but I saw this rhetoric of warrior masculinity, also shaping approaches to domestic politics, really driving culture wars politics. And so I was intrigued. I thought there was something there, and then I put the project aside for years. Because I had a first book to finish, still turning my dissertation into a book. Also, I had a baby, and then I had another baby, and I realized it was all a bit much, and I thought maybe someday I'll get back to it. I don't know. But I didn't stop paying attention to the preachers, the pastors who were promoting this very aggressive vision of Christian manhood, and what I saw is it went from bad to worse. And I also saw how one after another of these pastors became embroiled in scandal, in sexual abuse or abuse of power, either directly as perpetrators or indirectly defending their friends who were perpetrators. And I just took notes, and it was astonishing the frequency with which this was happening. Fast forward to the fall of 2016. October 2016, the release of the Access Hollywood tapes. You may remember the world kind of stopped because at that point, just weeks before the 2016 election, it was clear and surprising to many that Trump's most stalwart supporters were in fact family values evangelicals, right? The moral majority wasn't making a lot of sense to begin with, and then we have Access Hollywood. And then everybody thought, surely this is a bridge too far for his evangelical supporters, right? The media was on this. Evangelical leaders themselves were thinking it's too much. In fact, a couple of Trump's evangelical supporters backed away ever so briefly. Wayne Grudem was one of them. But then he prayed about it, and by the end of the week was back supporting Donald Trump. Right, which then the question of the hour was, how could white evangelicals betray their values to support a man who bragged of assaulting women? But I knew right then that we had seen this before. We had seen this over and over again in their own churches, in their own organizations, protecting a powerful man, protecting a predator, throwing victims under the bus. We had seen this before. And so after the election, I dusted off some of that old research from a decade earlier, and I wrote a little piece on evangelical masculinity and militarism, and it went absolutely viral. And what I saw is, I know you're not supposed to read the comments, but what I saw in those comments was one after another, evangelical men themselves, or formerly evangelical men who said, this is exactly what I saw. This is what I experienced. And so that prompted me to decide to write the book that became Jesus and John Wayne. And I will tell you that one of the first things that I did when I thought I need to turn this into a book was I checked in with a lawyer, because I knew I needed to include these stories of abuse. But the thing is, this was pre-Me Too. And so the majority of these stories were out on survivor blogs and in local papers on occasion, regional newspapers. But I thought, what's my liability here? Can I actually use this? And I talked to the lawyer and got enough assurance that, no, go ahead, and then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. While I was writing the book, and before I got to that last chapter, Me Too happened, and Church Too. And these stories that I had known about, they were out there, and that anybody could find out about if they cared to, became national news stories. So that was a relief to me, because I didn't have to worry about the liability issue anymore. But I will say that writing that last chapter, the chapter that inspired this film, was the hardest thing. Reading these accounts, and there were so many more than what made the chapter, and so many more in the chapter than what we have here in this film. In fact, I pleaded with my editor more than once. Does this chapter really have to be in this book? Even late in the game, every time I was editing, and you go through the book like hundreds of times, I was like almost done, making great progress, things are in good shape, and I would turn that page and see that chapter. And I just have to brace myself to deal with it again. The stories were so harrowing. But he told me, yes, Kristen, you have to keep this in. Although he did have a critique when he read an initial draft. He, in words that only a writer would appreciate, editorial feedback, he called the chapter bloated and undisciplined. So, and the reason, what I told him is, blame the men. There were just so many predators, so many stories to get in there, and it was just too much. So I had to slash a whole bunch of stories out. And I decided you only got to stay in this chapter if you had a role in the earlier part of the book. Right? There are so many stories. And I started to see these patterns, these horrifying patterns of blaming the victim over and over again. And you'll hear some of that here. So that is the backstory to the chapter that inspired this film. And as you will see in this film, there is a political framing, because I came to this topic through looking at gender and politics, right? And so that is here in this film as well. And before we watch the film, I wanted to close with just a comment or two on the film's title, For Our Daughters. When the team, and first, I want to give another shout out here too. The origins of the movie itself, not my idea at all. An Emmy Award-winning filmmaker approached me with an interest in doing a documentary or documentary series on Jesus and John Wayne. His name is Carl Byker. He's the brother of Galen Byker. Total coincidence, but there you have it. So there's a kind of Calvin connection once removed here. And he wanted to do a documentary. And so we were saying, well, let's just gather some initial footage. And he said, well, let's start with some of these women's voices. He said, they're so powerful. Let's just start with that, and then we'll see where we go and pitch it, and we'll go from there. And as soon as we started interviewing these women, we knew that what we had was so powerful, and we knew that a longer project, which is still quite possibly in the works, would take a very long time to do. And so we felt a sense of urgency to bring these women's voices into a larger public at this particular moment. So then we had to come up with a title. One of the titles suggested from a long list of my film team was For Our Daughters. And immediately when I saw that, I knew that was the right title for this film. And you'll hear in the film the line that prompted it. But the reason I knew absolutely and instantly that it was the right title was because of something that happened just months after Jesus and John Wayne released. I was contacted by 3 conservative evangelical women, a couple of whose names I kind of recognized as women of some standing in the evangelical space. And they said they wanted to talk to me about the book. And so I assumed that they would have some critique. The book was described at the time as urgent and sharp-elbowed, and I think that's accurate. And so I kind of, braced myself for, okay, let's see what their quibbles are. But that wasn't it at all. They said, "Thank you, Kristen." And they said, "It is too late for us." They said, we have made our lives, and we can't walk away from the lives that we've made, but we want something different for our daughters. And so I've carried their words with me to this day, and this film is for their daughters. It's for all our daughters, and we hope for something different. So with that, I will turn things over to the film, and then happy to take your questions afterwards.
I was raised to be a wife and a mother one day. So my whole purpose was to become this godly woman and not to serve my own needs or desires.
As a girl growing up in the church through the purity culture, what I really gained from that was that if I was this amazing Christian woman who loved the Lord and was a good person, then the most I could hope for was God was going to bring me this amazing, godly Christian man.
I was raised in the church. So the idea that these men, pastors, watch over your soul, this was the fishbowl I swam in. This was simply all I knew.
But what Kate, Jules, and Krista didn't know was that the men who claimed to be their guides and protectors cared far less about them than about their own power. Their power over women and their power over the country.
How do you make America great again? You make America Christian again.
We get called, well, you're a Christian nationalist. You want the kingdom to be the government. Yes?
The point of Christian nationalism, my goal, is to break American democracy.
I'm going to be a dictator for one day.
We need total dictator Trump. The Constitution is invalid.
Christian nationalists see themselves as entrusted with this duty to take back the country.
God, we didn't come just to go to church. We came to go to war.
Their plan for winning this war is for Christian men to be aggressive, militantly masculine, even violent. And if they win, American women will be required to give them control of their bodies, just like the Christian women who have already been living under their authority.
My dad would say that he is the prophet, priest, and king of the household. And we were taught that men were strong and powerful and protectors, and they had a lot of positive language to describe the patriarchs. And then women had to be the helpers and to submit.
I have 4 people in my life that I dictate the hours in their day. I dictate what time they go to the bathroom, when we eat, what we wear. Those are the people that I have almost limitless authority with.
Anytime I showed a strong individual desire, then that was shut down. So I had to be quiet and weak just to survive. My whole goal in life was to grow up, get married, and have children. And we didn't believe in things like birth control. So the expectation was that we'd have as many children as possible. And our parents would use us to bring about this change in the country. We would make the country a Christian country.
Godly women want to feed their men. Godly women are designed to make the sandwiches. But this is not an absolute law like the one about making babies.
Christians need to be thoughtful about this with our kids. They're all arrows. They're all to be sharp and they're all to do damage to the enemy. But we want our daughters to grow up seeing what they're for.
We're just going to outbreed these people. We are.
There has been a lot of talk about Christian nationalists' drive to take over the country and about their strict view of the roles of women and men. What's been hidden until now is that their views of what men and women should be like in the new America are already triggering one of the most shocking sexual abuse scandals in our history.
When you've created a culture where manhood and womanhood is defined by submission and authority, you have created a culture where authority goes unchecked and easily becomes abuse. And so men think they can get away with abuse because they actually can get away with it.
Andy Savage, my youth pastor, was very gregarious. He was a good-looking guy, super fun, and so when he came to my church, everybody was so excited that this charismatic man was coming to bring more kids to Christ and make the youth group a cool place to be. Many of us in the youth group had gone up to church after school one day to hang out. Ultimately, it was going to be me and Andy there, and I didn't have a ride home. And so I remember calling my mom and asking her, is it okay if Andy brings me home? And she said yes. As we were driving home, Andy passed the turn to my house, and I remember asking him, where are we going? And he said, you'll see. Suddenly, he had turned down a dark dirt road and parked the truck and turned the lights off. And the next thing I knew, he was taking his penis out of his pants. And then he suddenly jumps up and runs out of the truck, and he's screaming, oh my God, what have I done? And he tells me, Jules, you have to take this to the grave with you. So in 2018, I finally got the courage to decide to come forward. And I looked up Andy Savage, who was now one of the leading pastors at a mega church in Tennessee, and I decided to write him an email. And I signed off #MeToo.
2 days later was a Sunday, and the head of the church announces to the congregation that Pastor Savage has something he needs to tell them. What happened next was so enraging, I wanted the world to see it. That's when the New York Times put the church's own video online.
I regretfully had a sexual incident with a female high school senior in the church.
He tells the world that it had occurred and that he was sorry. And everybody stands and they give him a standing ovation.
And when you see the congregation standing up and applauding an abuser, which happens over and over, it's very emotionally satisfying to accept quote-unquote repentance
to emotionally identify with the abuser, because what it gives you is this very neat, tidy story of restoration, allegedly. Right? It gives you this pretty little package with a bow on top where you can say, look how beautiful it is, God redeems. And it costs you nothing. It costs you something to side with the vulnerable and the weak and the oppressed. It costs you nothing to side with the one who's in power.
One of the kickers is that I remember them saying, "We are saddened to see that Miss Woodson has not been on the same path to healing as Andy." Are you kidding me? This didn't affect him 1 ounce. He was celebrated. You don't just move on after trauma. And when society and the church acts like it didn't happen, disposes of the victims, then it's re-traumatizing all over again. We've had the Me Too movement, but we still see the same toxic crap, excuse my language, happening in the church. There has got to be equality. There has got to be women having a voice.
That's the voice of toxic femininity, right? There's toxicity there, but it's a rebellion against the way God made the world. So God made the world in such a way that the husband is the head, the wife is to look up to her husband, calling him Lord.
They are subjugating half the population, the whole female population. To be able to justify that and rationalize it with all earnestness and true belief that this is God's will, that is very, very powerful and extremely destructive. You imagine, I'm this 15-year-old goody two-shoes nerd. I've never held hands with anyone. The pastor, right? This is my pastor. He holds the authority of God. He sexually grooms me. He sexually abused me. I'm sexually assaulted over 30 times as a 16-year-old girl. I told the music minister of the church. He told me I should never again speak of it. The senior pastor told me I should rededicate my life to Christ. The pastor who did it made me kneel in his office while he stood over me, praying out loud, hand on my shoulder, praying for God to cast Satan from me, essentially a sort of exorcism. And I slithered out of there feeling lower than I had ever felt. And then I was made to apologize to his wife. I am the girl who was blamed.
Sexuality really is taught as existing only for men. Women exist as a means to an end, the sexual satisfaction of their husbands, or as a danger to a godly man. And then coupled with that is often a strong teaching that this need that men have, this sexual need that men have, is absolutely irrepressible, right? That it's God-given, and that they must have sexual release. And what that really does is it places the responsibility for sexual purity in every single instance squarely on the shoulders of the woman. If something goes wrong, if a man abuses, if he lusts, if he has sex outside of marriage, right? Well, that's the woman's fault.
And he went on to, a bigger and better job at a more prestigious church. I'm sure he had a higher paycheck. And his whole career, he never faced a bit of consequence. When my own daughter approached the same age I had been, I just couldn't. I couldn't live with knowing how things were. So that was the start of it. This massive institutional enablement of
horror must be addressed on an equally massive scale.
Any woman who dares to speak publicly, then they will rain almighty hell on you. Some of the people who vilified me publicly were the highest leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant faith group in this country. These are not just, some deranged, isolated people. No, this is part of the culture of what they do to women who speak out.
Why is it that simply raising your voice about the mistreatment of women in the church and about the reality of sexual abuse in the church is enough to try to categorize you as a demonic influence and to silence your voice?
And then, it all built on itself. When I wrote my first op-ed for the Dallas Morning News, it had my email address at the bottom of the op-ed. I was flooded with stories from other people. I got so many emails saying, "You're the first person I've ever told." That was when I thought, oh, this isn't just one bad pastor or even a dozen. This is a lot.
For all of the years that I carried the secret, I thought that I was the only one. I just did not imagine that this was something that happened often. So imagine my surprise when I find Krista Brown speaking out. Right about the time that I was finding my voice and deciding that I couldn't be quiet anymore. My pastor was Jerry Vines. Pastor Vines became a godlike figure. Daryl Gilliard, Dr. Vines saw something in him. Gilliard was a fiery figure. He's on Jerry Falwell's television program and radio program.
Let's welcome back to our pulpit, Daryl Gilliard.
I want to bring a message this morning entitled Peace Amid the Storm.
Daryl Gilliard found me in our youth group. And when Daryl Gilliard came to me and told me he saw something, it was as if the Pope reached down and said, "I see something in you." He basically told my parents even that he wanted to mentor me, that he saw something special in me, which in that world was pride for my parents. What we didn't know is that Daryl had many victims already, had attacked so many other people. One of the nights of the revival, Daryl told me that he needed to speak to me after service. And I asked where. And he asked me to meet at the hotel. He said, "Be in the open," and that's where everything went haywire. He chased me all the way through the hotel because he was right on my heels. By the time we get to the parking lot and I look back and realize he's still coming and nobody's coming with him, and it is in a dark, desolate area of the city. And just like a horror movie, you can't get your keys in your hand to get into the car. He's on me from behind, and he's on top of me. Like, again, just like a horror movie, you're just trying to get the key in the lock. And animal instincts kick in, my adrenaline is high and I'm strong. And I somehow finally managed to get the key in, and at the same moment reach back and just shove him. I managed enough to get into the car, but he was still coming. I can see him still in my back windshield as he's trying to leap towards the car. But I got away. And I drove all the way home thinking he's chasing me. My mother was waiting up for me, and she was very angry that I had missed my curfew, and then she saw me, and I just collapsed on the floor. I'd made it safely inside the door and locked the door. My mom decided she was going to call Dr. Vines. That was her first thought. Not call the police. I'm going to call Dr. Vines. Jerry Vines sat while I'm distressed across his desk, having to tell this horrible story. And Jerry Vines looked across the table with absolutely no reaction or no sense of, I can't believe this has happened. There was no sense of fear or worry other than about us telling. And the question was, who else knows? Who else have you told? No one. No one. Just mom. I told my mom. I haven't told anyone else. But it's good that you didn't tell anybody. Let's keep it that way. You know, it'd be really embarrassing for you if people knew. It'd be really embarrassing for you if people found out about this. When we left that office that day, we understood that Jerry Vines was calling Paige Patterson and that they were going to move forward in removing him from ministry. Dr. Vines was a very prominent figure, but higher than that was Paige Patterson. I assumed, again, that I was the only one, and I assumed that it would be shocking to both of them, not fully understanding that they already knew.
The church must do the right thing to help Brother Darrell.
Patterson stood in the pulpit and invited Darrell in, and when he came in, you can see this moment of him embracing him like a son. And as they stand there embracing, the audience claps in a standing ovation for the man who just weeks before sexually assaulted me as a teenager.
As to whether or not his total ministry...
But worse, so much worse. Immediately and in that moment, they said they wanted to restore him.
Brother Darrell has asked me to walk with him and others also of his dear friends across this country, including Dr. Falwell, Dr. Vine, in a process of restoration. That's exactly what we intend to do.
If we took scripture seriously, we would recognize that church leaders are held to a much higher standard. But in reality, we treat them with such a level of deference that there's almost no accountability at all. That's not God. That's not what he's commanded his church to be, and it's certainly not biblical justice. Finally, years later, he was arrested for crimes against 2 minor girls in his church. So the courage came like a roaring lion, and there was no holding back at that point. I am not gonna be quiet again. And so when I called the sex crimes detective, the sex crime detective immediately tells me it's probably not gonna go anywhere. He's too powerful. Her exact words, he's too powerful, and I think these charges will be swept under the rug. You have the Vines and the Patterson, you know, Falwell, all of those voices that don't want this to come out. Again, that lion, I was like, not this time. Not this time. And I said, what do we need? What do we need to make this stronger? And she said, we need more victims. And we need victims that can testify because these are 2 young girls. And they can't probably stand up to the weight of a prosecution and a trial and all of the things. So that's what I set out to do. I wanted to bring awareness to it. I wanted to go public. So I called every news station in our city and said, I have a story to tell, and I don't want to be off camera. I want to be on it. I want to put a face to it because these victims can't. They're too young. By the end of the case, there are more than 40 known victims of Gilliard when the state attorney closed their files. I reached out to both Vines and Patterson and said, please do the right thing now. You might not have done the right thing for me then, but continually I asked them, step up now. But instead, what I was told by Jerry Vines was, you know, Tiffany, given a little bit of time, these things tend to just go away. They don't lose sleep over it. They don't even bat an eye.
And they may pat themselves on the back and look at themselves and say, well, I never abused anyone. They did. They did by perpetuating this system.
So there is this need to maintain power at all costs. Whatever casualties come are just casualties. It's just part of war. That's their mentality. And they have completely lost their actual role as pastors and shepherds in their power war.
Ezekiel 23:30 said, God looked for a man to stand in the gap, but none was found. God found one in Donald J. Trump.
And we are coming on the air with news about former President Donald Trump, as a jury in New York has found that Trump sexually abused and defamed E. Jean Carroll and awarded her $5 million in damages.
In a unanimous, historic verdict, he's been found guilty of 34 separate charges after he paid off a porn star.
You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. Just I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy. You can do anything.
It may seem surprising that a self-professed moral majority would end up supporting a candidate who has bragged about assaulting women. But if you look inside their own communities, you can see how for decades they have propped up men who have abused power and have excused all kinds of harm, all kinds of abuses for the sake of that power. The ends justifies the means.
I will fight even harder for Christians with 4 more years in the White House. I get in there, you're going to be using that power at a level that you've never used it before.
We wake up tomorrow in a Christian nation. Will women have the right to vote tomorrow if you wave that magic Christian wand?
No.
God doesn't need these people. I mean, let's talk about narcissism. Truly. I mean, for you, these men, to think that they are so important to the mission, to God, to the nation, give me a break.
The last and perhaps the most powerful temptation of Jesus was when he was brought up to a high mountain and the devil said to him, I will give you all the nations of the world if you only bow down to me. And Jesus refused. Now, people today are claiming that the church needs to have the power over other people, which it strikes me as exactly the same temptation that came to Jesus on that mountain. And Jesus said no. He said no because power corrupts. It always corrupts.
Hey, we'll talk about the insurrection. Let me tell you something. You ain't seen the insurrection yet. My Bible says that the church of the living God is an institution, that the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And the Bible says that we'll take it by force.
When people talk about turning the U.S. into a Christian nation, it makes me quake to ponder what that would mean for women in this country. Because I have seen what it means for the largest evangelical Protestant faith group in the country, and it is bloody awful. But that is not the country I want.
I feel like Jesus called us to love others. And I think that's what could make America great, is if everyone could come together and realize that we all have differences and we walk different paths, we have different stories, we have different backgrounds, but one common denominator could be that love.
Macho power is not what Jesus calls for. Jesus himself did not operate in that way. Jesus was gentle. He was humble, particularly in his relationship with women. And that way, he told us men what we are to be like. In fact, it's my conviction that that kind of idea that we need to have more power so that we can have our way, or people will say God's way within society, is the exact opposite of what Christ calls us to do.
And I think what we have to grapple with again is that the reality that those of us who are raising our voices are not calling for a departure from Christ, but rather a return to who Christ really is.
There we go. While our panelists come to the front here and get settled, I wanted to give you a few instructions about how to submit questions for this time of question and answer. So the papers that you were handed on your way in have QR codes on them, and if you would like to submit a question that way, you may use your phone to scan that, type in the question, and it will come to my phone, and I will present the questions to our panelists. If you would rather not do the QR route, you can just write something on the back of the paper, and someone will come around and collect those from you. If you did not get a little piece of paper on your way in and you would like one, just raise your hand and someone will come around and hand that to you. Before we get started, though, we're going to have our panelists introduce themselves.
So you already know who I am, but we'll have each of our panelists just briefly introduce themselves and tell briefly about their connection to this film and why they're here tonight.
Hey everyone, I'm Rachel Verwise, and I serve as CEO at Safe Haven Ministries. So we partnered in the film screenings here locally. Safe Haven is an organization that prevents violence in our community. We partner with Calvin and the group here and the SPEAK team on sexual violence prevention on Calvin's campus. And we do education around really the entire community in any sector that you can think of. And then we serve and support survivors of domestic violence, stalking, dating violence, and human trafficking through emergency safe shelter, advocacy, and supportive housing.
My name is, can you hear me? I already did that. Hello? Okay. My name is Kate West, and I'm a writer and editor. I live here in Grand Rapids. I grew up in the Christian patriarchy movement. Other terms for that might be Quiverful, if you're familiar with the Duggars. That's my background. And I have a book that came out a few months ago now called Rift, talking about that journey. And I met Kristen online a few years ago and asked her to read an early version of that book. And she very kindly endorsed it. And ever since, she's been someone I admire very much. And so when she asked me if I was interested in participating in this film, it was a definite yes for me. This is an issue that I care very much about. Also, I am a part of another organization called Tears of Eden, which is a nonprofit focusing on spiritual abuse, which often overlaps with these issues. So we have some resources on our website. You can check that out, tearsofeden.org. I'm on the editorial board there. So if you ever want to share your story,
I'm Leonard Vanderzee. I'm a retired pastor in the Christian Reformed Church, although the Christian Reformed Church doesn't want me anymore, so I'm sort of on my way out. I first met Kristen back when she was in graduate school in South Bend, where I was a pastor, and then we got acquainted even more when I'm the interim pastor right now at Church of the Servant here in Grand Rapids, and she's a member of that congregation, so she roped me into this wonderful project.
I did. I feel like I should say a word to exactly how Len got roped in, and I think I've apologized a number of times for doing this to you, but when we were working on this film, the director, Carl, said, you know, we really need a man's voice here. I was like, do we, though? He said, no. And he said, yes, we do. And he suggested a couple of prominent individuals, and I was familiar with, could have reached out to, but I said, you know, I know a guy. And so I actually sent a couple of links to Len's sermons as his audition that he didn't know he was doing. And when Carl heard them or watched them, he said, absolutely. And so, you know, for me, it was fitting, I think, because on the one hand, I mean, there's a needle that we kind of threaded in terms of wanting to critique the church and Christianity when they get things wrong, and not feeling a need to come in and rescue it, right? Not wrap it up in this neat little bow. And on the other hand, for me personally, you know, I'm a Christian, I'm an active member of a church, I teach at a Christian university, and I, along with Rachel Denhollander, insist you guys are getting it wrong, right? And that there's a different way to be a Christian. And there are pastors out there who present a different vision of Christianity, a different vision of power, and what it means for Christians, right, to give up power, to be faithful in that sense that runs counter to the messaging that we're getting from a lot of corners right now, that, you know, as my research suggests, is linked to abuse of power in homes, in families, in churches, and is linked to an aggressive political agenda as well, both of which harm people and harm Christianity. And so that feature.
Okay, if you have questions on paper that you would like to have collected, feel free to just kind of hold them up a little bit so that someone can see it and bring them to me. We have several questions, they're all great, so I'm just going to dive right in. Two people asked, how can we best come alongside women like Jules who have bravely shared their stories but have been criticized, threatened, or harassed? And a second question that's very similar.
Okay. Yeah, I guess the number one thing is to believe people when they tell you this has happened to them. It's very rare for someone to lie about this. It's not something that is fun to talk about. I think the best you can do is be there with that person and ask them what they want. Any kind of abuse, there's always this aspect of power and control, and your agency is taken away from you. Every kind of abuse. So when that happens, you feel untethered and you're looking for help. One of the best ways you can help someone who's in that situation is to ask them questions, to get them to think for themselves, not to point them in one specific direction, but say, what do you need? What do you want? And that enforces that idea that they have agency, that agency wasn't completely taken away, that they still have power. And I think that's the number one thing I tell people is that's the root of any kind of resources you might point them to, and I'm sure you can help with more logistical kinds of resources.
No, I would agree with Kate that it is believing someone. To be able to disclose takes a lot of disclose, they don't know who to share with. And so believing someone's agency matters, letting them be the director of their next choices. Particularly I think people who want to help can come up with a lot of ideas of what that next step is, but it is really letting that person guide the next step. Another thing is having no judgment, not asking why questions and trying to dig. It's not your job to investigate. It is your job to listen and believe, and then also making referrals, I would say. It's a lot to hold a disclosure. It's why people are social workers and have degrees to walk alongside and support survivors. It's also how, for instance, when we're helping victims of domestic violence, safety planning is something that is really personal. It's a case-by-case basis. People will often say, well, why can't someone just leave? And it is so complex to navigate abuse and that misuse of power and control. And so to have an advocate or a counselor who's trained in navigating particularly abuse situations is really important. That doesn't mean you're not a support still and you walk alongside, but also finding an agency that can walk with that person. I think the other thing that we've talked about too is when accountability is needed, particularly when you're working with minors, and mandated reporting is necessary. So you've heard a lot of stories in which law enforcement was not engaged. Now I think that's different between adults and minor victims. And yet we know if you work in an institution of any kind, you need really good policies and practices in place to hold accountability. And so I'll say even we as an organization right now are submitting to the state of Michigan our sexual harassment policy. And we've had to rewrite it. That's how strict they are and how we have to have our own policies in place as an employer of people. So to think that we hold that standard to every institution that we're a part of, that there are policies in place that hold people accountable. I think this is the thread we heard over and over again is the lack of accountability. And so when you're working with a survivor, where are the accountability mechanisms that also bring protection for them and making sure that you are supporting in that and holding confidentiality around it. It doesn't have to be told to a lot of people. And so that accountability can come without disclosing and breaking confidentiality as well.
I'd like to add I think some people think that the patriarchy movement that you were talking about and experienced in your life is sort of going away. It's not going away. It's growing today. You can hear it for podcasts. You can hear it from prominent pastors. My own denomination, the Christian Reformed Church, in the 1990s decided to ordain women to office, yet more than half of the Christian Reformed churches do not have any women in office. And the movement toward not doing it is growing rather than getting less. And I firmly believe, as you said, that patriarchy is really at the bottom of this abusive crisis. And finally, it's biblical bunk. It is biblical bunk. This idea of male headship as created by God and demanded in the church, there are a number of solid scholars who have shown from studies in the New Testament, the Old Testament, that it's just plain wrong.
Oh, I hope we have that for an Instagram reel, Lynn. We'll just the bunk part. We'll do it. I would say too that a couple of other things for if you think, well, I haven't heard stories or I don't have proximity. What can I do in that case? I don't have people coming to me. 2 points on that. First of all, if you signal that you care about this issue, if you signal that you take this seriously, there is a pretty good chance you're going to start hearing stories. Krista in the film, talked about how that she wrote that op-ed and the stories started coming, and how many survivors first think they're alone. They think it was just them, and then they're blamed, and then they think, what did they do wrong, and then you start to realize if you speak out, more and more stories will surface. And so if you aren't hearing any stories, maybe you need to educate yourself, care about this, and signal that this is something actually you're invested in learning more about and in taking seriously, and you may be in a different position. The other thing I would say is if you are a member of an organization, there are the dynamics that are just kind of knee-jerk, which is to circle the wagons and protect the reputation of the organization. Now, this is true for all organizations, really, but then it's really amped up for religious organizations because you have a special mission, right? And it's not just your mission, it's God's mission. And so there is this overwhelming response, I think, even from well-intentioned people, to cover it up. Let's not air our dirty laundry, because you don't want to harm the man's ministry, a phrase you hear often, or you don't want to harm the witness of the church. That kind of language over and over again. And that language leads a lot of really good people to do some really bad things and to allow bad things to continue to happen.
There have been a couple questions that have come in about accountability, and one of them is kind of this: how have we gotten to the point, or how has it been so difficult for accountability to happen and for prosecutions to happen? So how do we get to this culture where survivors aren't able to get the the accountability that's needed, and also why is there so much fear in doing that, and in coming forward?
Well, that's a really complex question, but so I'll say I think all of us can give insight into that because last night when we did the film screening, I think at the end I shared that the Violence Against Women Act is only 30 years old in the United States. It's only been 30 years. It's not that long. And so if we think about the fact that there haven't been actually accountability systems in place or resources or guidelines and training on how to set up those systems of accountability, it makes sense a bit where we are. So there's lots of nonprofits and organizations who have no policy around sexual harassment. So if you have a culture, any organization has a culture, and if you haven't embedded into the culture of that organization key principles and practices of accountability, because you can write a policy and not enforce it as well. So if you've read Jesus and John Wayne, you can look at the historical perspective of how we got to where we are. We didn't wake up today and it just happened. And so I think you hear in survivor stories, and I see here, I think in the role that I'm honored to be in, I have people disclose to me all the time. And when I hear women who are older than me share their stories, I know their experience is different than my generational experience. And yet we have a long ways to go. And so this idea that, and I'm going to say we're in West Michigan, the West Michigan nice thing is real. And so we don't disrupt and we don't tell the truth out loud so that other people hear and then bring the accountability. We do greater harm when we are not telling the truth about abuse in our institutions, from the church to schools to workplaces, because we're signaling that you can get away with it. And it just perpetuates that misuse of power and control. And the power dynamic is real because there's lots of different ways that that abuse happens. It's sexual abuse, it's financial abuse, it's emotional abuse, it's controlling the way someone operates in their world. And when you have families that are connected to that, children, it becomes really complex. And I think when we talk with, I love Jesus, and I love being a part of a faith community, and I love my marriage. And if we idolize marriage to the point where we don't bring in the biblical principles that I think Jesus gave us, then we will allow abuse to be perpetuated in it. And in the church, we've done that at times. We don't always have to do that. But there are things that we have not instituted, and then practices that we've perpetuated that don't allow safe spaces for survivors to share. Now, I don't think it stops there. So, but
And it's important, I think, just for people to ask their pastors, their church leaders, do you have an abuse policy? What is it? Look at it. Ask your denominational leaders. The Christian Reformed Church has, for, I don't know, maybe 25 or 30 years, had an office of, I can't remember the name of it, what? Safe Church, thank you. But there are still lots of churches, it's up to congregations to comply. Lots of churches have no compliance whatsoever. And it requires things like, in my particular congregation, there is a level of accountability and investigation for different offices, background checks, those kind of things for everything from drivers of buses to Sunday school teachers. That's the level of safety which is required.
I think the culture that enables abuse, you need to dig down into what's really happening with the teachings. I think all the stories of the women who shared what happened to them, they were all raised in this church culture where women are supposed to be submissive and quiet and don't ask questions, and the men are the leaders and they're the ones who know what's best. And I grew up in the church hearing lots of sermons about Jezebel and sexual purity and how women have to cover up their bodies, and there's all this focus on women protecting or, trying to hide from men because men can't control themselves. That purity culture, that term purity culture is really rape culture. We're creating the basis for this to happen. It's not an anomaly. It goes with the territory. And so I think it's really important to examine, what are you teaching about gender? What are you teaching little girls about themselves, about consent? I never heard the word consent. I was raised to never say no to my husband, and that included in the bedroom. So it's the issue of marital rape is very common in these kinds of places where this teaching is happening. It's heartbreaking. I hear story after story of that happening. The first time I shared a little piece of what happened to me with my pastor, and this is pretty common with abuse survivors, you share a tiny little piece to see how, you don't think about it, but you don't want to share everything because you're not sure how they're going to react. I shared a little bit, and I was crying. It was like this horrible thing. I betrayed my dad, and I just said, please don't call him right away. Don't tell him, because my dad was an elder in the church. And, it's a big accusation to accuse an elder of abuse. So I said, at least just let me get home, because I was on foot. I didn't have a car. I was in my 20s. And I don't remember if I go back, I think, did I just not emphasize that enough? Did he not understand me? I try to give him some excuses, but whatever that might be, when I got home, I got to my bedroom. I had to run through the forest to get home. My dad came home from his errand. That was the one time I could get out of the house. And immediately the phone rang. And that was one of the worst days of my life. And it seemed so small, but the amount of rage my dad came into my bedroom with was no light thing. It was the first time I had a panic attack. And I learned really quick, don't talk to your pastor. Because my safety was not prioritized in that situation. I felt extremely unsafe. And so I tell that just to say that's the culture a lot of us come from, and that's why so many of us don't want to talk about it, because it makes our safety more at risk. And so we need to change that whole culture and the root of what's being taught to begin with.
I want to reiterate what Kate was saying about the theology and the role of these teachings. And this was it's just so shocking to me when I was, again, researching and writing that chapter, coming across stories not just of abuse, and abuse is horrific, but I mean, so many survivors have told me that worse than the abuse itself was the way that their faith communities responded to them, which is a whole lot to let that sink in, right? In the research, I came across stories of these kind of purity teachings where it said boys will be boys. God made men, filled them with testosterone. Sexual restraint isn't really their thing, which is why if you're not married, you have to protect the purity of all the men around you so that they don't lust because they can't help themselves. And if you are married, you have to meet your husband's every sexual need. So as Rachel said in this film, there is always a woman to blame. I encountered these teachings. I encountered cases where young girls were blamed for seducing their father, where mothers were blamed for not sexually satisfying their husbands so that he was going down the hall to their daughter's rooms. And I could not believe what I was reading. And then I came across another one and another one, right? So these teachings are real. And then the added teachings that women are to be submissive and silent. So you're supposed to meet their needs, and then you're supposed to be silent. And you can see how this creates an incredibly toxic space, dangerous space for women. And then women who do tell, you saw these stories of, no, they do the worst thing, and they cover up, and they meet with the elders, and they protect the predator, and they find ways to blame survivors. And if you are in this space at all, I mean, I think you used the word Jezebel. I mean, who among us hasn't been called a Jezebel, right? You will be if you are speaking out publicly on this issue in faith communities, right? The vitriol that is then aimed at survivors who dare to call this out and threaten to undermine the authority of those in power. And that authority comes through this guise of righteousness that they wield so viciously, right? I mean, this is the reality now. You might think, oh my gosh, that doesn't characterize my church at all. That's great, right? If it doesn't, if you're sure. But sometimes you don't know until issues surface, and you don't know how people will respond, or you don't know what has been kept from sight, right? So, there are many things that you can do, and I think one of the first things is just being aware of these dynamics and how they have played out time and time again, and then do everything you can to be alert to that and preventative strategies. And I mean, Len, you were mentioning some of our church's policies. I love our church because they do all sorts of things. They have elaborate rules for if a 2 or 3-year-old has to use the bathroom during children's church time, and they always have to use the bathroom. And so what they do is they literally have to take the whole class out this little like trail of ducklings all to the bathroom so that nobody's ever alone, right? And then all a trail back, that sort of thing. They keep the doors of Sunday school classrooms locked if they are not in use, because that prevents these hidden spaces from being accessible if you don't have a reason to be in there. These are things that I hadn't thought of. And then when I do our annual Safe Church training, and I'm like, wow, that makes so much sense. So on our website, forourdaughter'sfilm.com, we also have a page of resources and you can find Kate's book and Krista Brown's book and other books by survivors and scholars, Rachel Denhollanders, Sheila Gregoire, Diane Langberg, lots of resources there. But you can also find links to organizations, including organizations that will come alongside churches, review your policies, and make sure that you have things running well.
We could go a lot of different directions. I think let's touch on a couple things that you all touched on a little bit and see if we can maybe go into a little deeper. In terms of like the accountability, what does that look like in spaces that are also really focused on grace and forgiveness?
I don't know if anyone's watched the film Women Talking, or is it Women Speaking? Women Talking? About a group, it's based on a true story actually, of a group of Mennonite women who had to decide what to do when they realized the extent of sexual abuse happening in their community. And there's this line, I'm gonna get it wrong, about forgiveness, because so many times over and over again they were told, you need to forgive and be quiet and stop talking about this. And in closed communities like that, you don't go to the police. Very similar to the church I grew up in. It wasn't Mennonite, but we didn't go to the police for anything like that. And she said something like, is forgiveness being silent? Like, what is the cost of forgiveness? Is it our silence? I wish I had it in front of me, but it's something like that. Like, the cost of forgiveness, it's not real forgiveness if you can't have agency over that, right? And it's required of you, and you have to be silent. Usually, that concept of forgiveness is used as a weapon against abuse survivors. Maybe not by everyone, but definitely by the abusers and the people who enable the abuse. And I think sometimes people are well-intentioned with that. They want to use that term forgiveness, but what they're really doing is disempowering the person that this happened to. And they get to decide if they're going to forgive that person. That's not always the best path forward. And it doesn't equal reconciliation, or letting that person continue to be a pastor or be a youth pastor. And oftentimes in these situations, like Andy Savage, you just continue to be a pastor and you go from church to church, and there's no accountability with that because they're forgiven, because they've said they're sorry. But that doesn't mean that you should have the access to more people to abuse.
Yeah, I think you can cheapen grace. And I think if we look at all of Scripture, grace and truth is throughout. And the accountability piece is part of grace, actually. So, when we work with churches, when we work with schools and organizations, we help them put in place accountability mechanisms. So, different churches and denominations have different ways that they ordain people and elevate people into power. We recognize that. And yet, I think you can have standards and practices that, one, don't break the law. So there's that piece that churches shouldn't ignore. And maybe they need to be told that by people in their congregation, outside of their congregation. And so, in my role, we do a lot of cross-sector collaboration. So I work with the prosecutor's office a lot here in Kent County. I'm not a lawyer, and prosecuting sexual abuse cases is really difficult. I work with colleagues at the Child Advocacy Center, forensic interviewers, detectives, and I think it burdens me the amount of I think burden we put on to victims. So you even heard in the story about how the minor victims couldn't testify in court, and so how was he going to be prosecuted? That is a reality across our court systems across the United States, the state of Michigan. You can't prosecute someone unless you have enough evidence. So that's a check and balance in our legal system. That doesn't mean, though, just because someone's not prosecuted, that they're not liable. And so, that's, again, where you're going to decide as an institution if you are going to follow good practice around that. And someone doesn't have to be, just because they're not prosecuted, doesn't mean they have to be in the same position of power that they were in when they harmed someone. That is a choice you can still make as a church, and that is something churches have to believe, that they can say you shouldn't be a pastor anymore because you have not upheld the standard of conduct that we would expect.
Exactly. Forgiveness doesn't mean restoration to that office where things can happen again. Oftentimes, I think with abusers, there are deep personality problems, issues in their background that make it more prone to happen again. Personally, I would say that a pastor who is either spiritually or physically abused somebody should not be in office anymore. They can find other employment, but not that.
On the question of forgiveness, I would recommend to you Rachel Denhollander's victim statement in the Larry Nassar abuse case, where she deals directly with this. Because Nassar, as Kate said, often abusers like to use this. Well, I've been forgiven, or demanding, or their friends will come and the pastor will demand that you forgive, and that's a kind of, okay, it's all done then, it's back to normal kind of thing. And Rachel's very clear in that statement that forgiveness does not negate justice, that forgiveness and justice go hand in hand. So she could forgive Larry Nassar, but which she did, while still holding him accountable, right? And that's just very important to keep in mind, that you may or may not choose to forgive, but you can still hold accountable. And on the issue too of how difficult this is to successfully prosecute. The successful prosecutions are a tiny sliver, we know, of actual instances of abuse, which is why, if you notice, this film is dedicated to the survivors who have spoken out, who have raised their voices, who are on the front lines, and also to those who have not. Because no survivor owes us or anyone that further sacrifice to put themselves in the fray, right? Sometimes for survivors, oftentimes, courage and victory even means, healing yourself and protecting yourself and not putting yourself out for this battle. So when I drew on survivors for this film, it was really important to me to only ask people who were already out in public on their own terms. And particularly in the case of these high-profile sex abuse survivors, I did not want to bring anybody into this space because I'd seen what had happened to them, and they knew exactly what they were saying yes to when I asked them to be in this movie. And I did not want to bring anybody else into that space because you don't actually know how horrific it is until you experience it. And it's awful that it has to be that way, but that is the reality.
We're getting lots of good questions, so at this point I'm pulling out themes that are common, and we're going to try to wrap up by 8:45 at the latest. So one of the common themes is so for women who are in communities that are very much male headship oriented, and maybe even the women do think that that's how the Bible is, sets things up. In those spaces, what can women do to create some agency or to help maybe even take some small steps to try to change the culture or find a voice and a way to combat some of the things they're experiencing?
I think it's important to note that if you're in danger, it's okay and it's good to get help for that. I think I always clarify anything I say with, if you're in immediate danger, leave immediately. And there are people and resources who can help you with that. If you're in a situation where there is some kind of coercive control or abuse happening in your family, but you're not in immediate danger, it's okay to take some time for yourself to think through what you want. And I think anytime there's abuse involved, you're trained not to think about that. You're trained not to think about what's good for you. And you're always thinking about the person who might be hurting you and what their reaction will be and what will happen to them. It's good to take time and plan what you want, to create a safety plan if you need to find support outside of that situation. And I always say to people, it's really difficult to do that when you're in these situations. So try to create like a physical space where you can go and be alone. Sometimes that's just like going on a walk outside away from your situation. When I was in my family, which there was a lot of different kinds of abuse happening, my bedroom, most of the time was safe. And I was able to, create some kind of sense of calm there, because when you're being abused or something's happening that's hurting you, your nervous system is dysregulated. And it feels like, like the adrenaline of hypervigilance. And so getting to a quiet place where you can get grounded and slow down your thinking can really help you feel confident in doing whatever the next step is for you. Yeah, I don't know. You can add to that.
Yeah, I think it is all individual. And creating, I think we often see, so we have support groups of all different kinds for people experiencing abuse, and a lot of time it's education. So there's a power and control wheel that talks about the different aspects of abuse, spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, and even just learning and educating on what does that even mean, can be really empowering for someone. And then it's creating, those like steps that are very individualized to the person's situation. Some people will leave and some people will not. And again, having no judgment about that, but knowing that you can create mechanisms of self-care, learning, education, and do that with the guide often of, I would say, finding an advocate. I know Safe Haven has 24/7 advocacy. You can text, chat, call. You can walk in Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. And so sometimes it's people walking in. We actually have mobile advocates who will go out in the community and meet with people as well, because we know some people's safest space to meet will be a regular place they go to in the community. And if there's a way to meet confidentially, they'll do that. But it is very individualized, and I think it's not us giving our idea of what the solution is, but really it's navigating personally what is the best solution given your context. It is leaving abusive situations. The most dangerous time is when someone has decided to leave often. And so recognizing that that's a really complex decision to make, and having the support systems in place. I'll say we get churches sometimes who are very eager to help, and then they'll say, well, we'll pay for a hotel for the weekend. Well, one weekend isn't going to be the long-term solution, right? So how do you create a plan with someone that takes into account it can't just be a quick fix? And so it is, it's a complex thing to walk with someone and support, and it's a long journey. I think on the table I have our holiday support groups start. The holidays are really hard to navigate when you still co-parent with someone who you've been in an abusive relationship with. So you have to think like sometimes it doesn't end, but you create different supports within that. And I think in some communities, closed communities like the Mennonite community that you're talking about, to leave that is to leave everything. And so every situation is unique.
One of the thoughts that helped me leave was thinking, well, first learning what abuse was and the vocabulary for that, so education, but then this thought that God doesn't want me to be abused. I think especially when there's religion involved with abuse, if something bad is happening to you, sometimes you can think it's your fault or you deserved this, but that is not true. That's a lie. And so I just want to emphasize, no matter what you decide to do, whether you want to be in a marriage, I think you're saying about like complementarian or something with male headship, just know that God doesn't want you to be harmed, whatever that looks like for you.
If I can speak as a man,
Please.
let me know if I'm wrong about this, okay? I would like to say to women, just be strong, because that's who you are. My wife, we've been married 26 years now. She was been married before. She was abused emotionally and sexually. She grew strong. I can't get away with it. If I take a position, or if she feels like I'm taking over for her in some way, or those kind, she'll tell me. And I'm seeing the young women students at Calvin. If you're testing out relationships with a man, check it out. Be strong, and if you get a reaction that like you can't be that way, get away.
Yeah, I think this question of complementarianism too, to me sometimes these categories, yes, they carry a lot of meaning, and on the other hand, sometimes they obscure reality. That there can be really beautiful marriages where the partners will say that they're complementarian. Oftentimes they're kind of de facto egalitarian, but they might label that. And there can be egalitarian marriages that are really toxic, right? And so I would say put away those labels to a certain extent, but if you hold to certain understandings about church leadership, even though it's bunk, apparently, possibly. But but even within complementarian systems, there's decency, right? And there are standards of behavior, the Bible's full of them, that ought to apply to men as well as to women. And men are supposed to love their wives as Christ loved the church. Now, I have read a whole lot of marriage books written by complementarians, and they are really bad on this. They will explicitly tell women it is your job to submit and to obey, and it is not your job to remind your husband what his job is. And that's where I will absolutely call bunk. And that, yes, so if you are in complementarian faith communities, if you are a woman and you see another woman mistreated, if you are a man in a complementarian community and you see a woman being mistreated, this is your moment. It absolutely is. And this is where people fail over and over and over again, because they will respect his patriarchal authority over his little kingdom there. And this is where I think you're getting, this is unbiblical. This is thoroughly unbiblical, right? To allow abuse, cruelty, right? Demeaning a fellow image bearer and then call it God ordained, right? So if you find yourself within a complementarian space, and if you are convicted to hold to certain theological beliefs, pay close attention to how those are being played out on the ground, and at least address that behavior and address the abuses within the system. I know a lot of complementarians get kind of sensitive with these kinds of works, and with Jesus and John Wayne of, we're not all bad. And I'm like, of course you're not all bad, but then take care of this problem inside your churches and inside your spaces. And that's where, honestly, they're not doing a great job. They really, really are not doing a great job on that front. And so we need the outside exposure, and we need the people committed to working on the inside.
Before we wrap up, I'm just wondering, do any of you have any last thoughts, like things that you feel like are really important to share and you haven't had a chance to share them yet?
It's hard to know who all is in the room, so I just want to affirm you, whoever you are, and whatever your story might be. You don't deserve abuse to happen to you. You deserve to have a life that's free and that you get to have decisions. And there are people, more and more people, who are speaking out about this. When I left over a decade ago, I felt really alone. And so sometimes when you don't know what's out there, it can feel really lonely to choose something different or to make a different decision. So just know that you're not alone. Once I left, the whole world opened up for me, and it's not easy, but there's so many more options. There's so many different ways that you can choose to live. And that's up to you, right? And so just know that you have some say about that. And there's a lot of people here who are willing to walk alongside you and be with you, and that whoever you want to be and wherever you want to go. And also just keep this in mind. Like, this is a political election season. Everyone's really anxious. I just want to share, like, seeing my neighborhood full of signs with the name of a man who's a sexual predator. It's hard just to go, I wake up in the morning and then that's the first thing I see. It's really difficult. And I know that there's probably lots of different perspectives here, but we can choose to vote for people who aren't sexual predators. And this is the third election that he's been a part of. I've never been able to vote in an election without being either coerced or having him on the ballot. I really hope for a better day where that's not an option. Yeah. So, but thank you for coming tonight.
Very brief mini sermon. Given the subject we're talking about tonight and the political atmosphere, what I think Christians are forgetting is that our Lord, Jesus Christ, died on a cross, hanging naked before a jeering crowd. He is our Lord. And he said, take up your cross and follow me. That's his direction.
One, I am encouraged that you're all here. I think we have an opportunity to be part of a movement where everyone can have healthy relationships. You know, part of Safe Haven's story is that 6 churches came together to start our first shelter and bought a building, bought a house in Grand Rapids. And I, as a student at Calvin, volunteered in that first house. I never knew that I would come back over 30 years later to lead the organization where we are today. And it is because of faithful people who have given to our mission that we are able to serve thousands of victims every year. So on one hand, I always say we hold pain and possibility all the time. I was overwhelmed today by the amount of pain that walked through our doors. But I believe that we can do better because I see that every single day. And the strength of survivors along this path is part of why we do better. Because survivors often do catalyze the change. We have a domestic violence specialty court in Kent County right now that was funded with $4 million because a survivor shared the story of her son being murdered. So, unfortunately, we're often moved by the worst circumstances. So, you all can be part of building the solution today, no matter where you are. If you're a student, you're a parent, you're an institutional leader, you're a teacher, whatever it is, you can believe someone, you can change policy, you can inspire the next generation of kids. You can teach consent to a 2-year-old with a board book. And so I do think we can choose together to create a new way forward. And that gives me hope. So there's a lot that is pulling us apart, and I have seen people not be partisan in this space. I have seen people come together and create new policies and laws and put funding where it is most needed. That doesn't mean we need more. We still need more funding. We're facing a huge funding shortfall for victim agencies across the United States right now. Probably a 50% cut in funding in the next fiscal year. That would be a tragedy. And yet, if all of us called all of our representatives, whoever they are, and started asking for that funding to be restored, it would be. And so that's, I think, what I'll leave you with is you can be part of the possibility of change and hope and healing in spaces that seem really dark and bleak.
I'll just say a quick word. Len already spoke to the younger generation here, kind of just starting off. I know we have an audience that spans multiple generations, and since Jesus and John Wayne published with this chapter on abuse in it, and again since the film came out, I have heard from women in their 70s and 80s who have told me that this is their story. And in one case, a woman who had never told anyone before. And she came up to me in a book signing line, and somebody started whispering in my ear, and I turned, and it was this woman, and she just needed to tell her story. And what I can say is there are people here who will believe you and who can walk alongside you and help you discern what your next steps may be. And then I'll close with a word for people of faith here, that, again, the tendency in faith communities and Christian communities is so strong to cover it up, to protect the witness of the church, protect Christianity. I love a quote from Rachel Denhollander and by the way, her apologies, she had childcare issues. She really wanted to be here tonight as well. But she has this powerful statement that I include in Jesus and John Wayne, and I consider it the moral heart of that book. She says, the gospel of Jesus Christ does not need your protection. Jesus only asks you to obey. And what does obedience look like? To tell the truth and to do justice. And that's it. And so I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you to all of you for being here tonight. And thank you to the CALL group, the Calvin Academy for Lifelong Learning, for providing refreshments afterwards tonight. CALL was one of our sponsors, along with several others around campus. And so, yeah, this was a group effort, and thank you very much for being here tonight.